Sarah Boone had her final day in court and her final say. Now that we've kind of recovered from the shock of what she pulled in court, let's take a careful look at the language she used and the fascinating things she did and didn't say. Hey everybody, it's Chris from Guilty Words, where we unravel crime one word at a time. It's taken a week to really go through Sarah Boone's shocking sentencing statement, some to just get over the sheer horror of it, and some to really deep dive into what she talked about, the language she used, the emphasis she placed, and some intriguing things she didn't say. This video is going to be long, so grab a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or a glass of wine. I'll put timestamps in the description, so if you just want to hop to sections that interest you the most, that's fine too. But let's get into it together, because there's a lot to cover.
I had a lot to say. I've had a lot of time to think about things, and I didn't really know how to put it on paper. And I didn't know how much I could say or how little I should say. So what I have here is, like I said, an edited version. But I would like to read the more important parts that I feel that everyone should know that wasn't said in my actual trial.
Sarah starts out by setting the stage for herself. She said, "I really didn't know how to put it on paper." Really? This is the woman who wrote a 58-page letter to the judge. She knows how to put things on paper. But she wants to read the more important parts that I feel that everyone should know that wasn't said in my actual trial. This is also a lie, because a lot of what she says during her statement was covered in her trial. In addition, she wants to make sure that everyone knows this is an edited version. This isn't her whole story that she wanted to tell. She's already making it clear that the statement she's making now is not to apologize to the family. It's to get her version out there. This is going to be all about her. Now, according to what some of you have said in comments and what I've seen on the internet, it was Mr. Owens who helped her edit this version. And a lot of people have said, if this is what she left in, what did she take out? And actually, we can figure that out. Sarah has always been given to exaggeration. Whatever it is that happens is always the extreme. So with her, it's not just the tip of the iceberg, her statement, it's the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg. And in case you weren't sure what that looked like, Sarah's statement is somewhere on the tip of the tip of the tip of that iceberg. Sarah begins with a narrative hook, in which she tells about kintsukuroi, a Japanese art form. When I listened to this, I mentioned in my video that it sounded so familiar and I couldn't place it. And a wonderful listener called Chocolate Chick 12 let me know that her description came from a book by Cindy Spiegel called A Year of Positive Thinking. This wasn't where I had heard the reference, it was somewhere else. But when I got a hold of this and I looked at January 2nd, sure enough, Sarah's exact description of this is word for word from that entry. Now, the problem with plagiarizing, besides the fact it's unethical, is that it shows that Sarah hadn't truly internalized this whole metaphor that she's using. It wasn't that this art form and how it could be used to explain fixing yourself really resonated with her, because if it had, she wouldn't need to just verbatim copy the description of it from a book. This was a handy metaphor that she could use and stretch ad nauseum to describe herself. She thinks of herself as one of these cracked vases filled with the gold that she's made from forgiveness. In my view, She's more like a dollar store vase that's held together with chewed bubblegum.
This has held me together, made me shine brighter, and overcome the damage caused by George Torres, the Torres family, the justice system, Orange County Corrections Department, social media, scoundrel detectives, infamy, defamation, ongoing constitutional rights violations, second-degree murder, forced into being pro se.
Sarah's list of the people and ideas that she has bountifully forgiven is fascinating. I think this is actually the table of contents of her original intent for her speech. I think Mr. Owens said, pick 3, because you cannot stand there for that long and go into the level of detail that she intended to about each and every one of these areas. So her top 3, George Torres, the Torres family, and social media. All of these others, the justice system, the corrections department, the detectives, infamy, defamation, constitutional rights, second-degree murder, being forced into being pro se, which in the end she wasn't, all of these got scrapped, if you will. But I don't think we missed much because we've read Sarah's letters and we know how she feels about all these. In one of the shocking parts of the descriptions of what she alleges George did to her, Sarah puts out a list of all of these actions, which are pretty horrific taken as a whole. However, usually when someone is explaining something like this long enough after the fact that they can be as calm as Sarah is, there'll be some kind of order to it. It will go from least hurtful to greatest. This is like somebody just grabbed words out of a thesaurus and threw them in any particular order. Every time he slapped me, kicked, punched, spit on, R-word, stabbed, choked, laughed at, pushed, pulled, dragged, whipped, tripped, stole from, lied, terrorized, threatened, humiliated, forced, degraded, made me cry. Every time he tried to end me, defeat, or destroy. She forgives him for all that. But the one word I want to pull out the most is the R-word that we can't see on YouTube. Because any woman who has experienced that kind of assault would not just throw it in the middle of a list like this, giving it equal weight with laughed at or tripped. The fact that something so serious is just another word in a list makes me doubt every single word in this list if I didn't already. It doesn't work. And not surprisingly, in the incredible amount of detail that she gives about things that have allegedly happened to her, she provides details that are not consistent with things that were proven in the trial. For example, I forgive George for beating me senseless for trying to sleep because I had to go to work. And yet Brian told the police she hadn't had a job in a couple of years. She goes on, for all the drunken rages and fistfights with so many neighbors when wandering into their apartments during hunting expeditions after I had escaped. Where did any neighbors ever testify to a drunkenly enraged George getting into a fistfight with them after wandering into their apartments hunting for Sarah? First of all, wandering doesn't go with hunting. You should be bursting in or kicking the door down or something. But this makes no sense in any way. If he had done that, there'd be a lot more calls to the police. And anyway, you know all the reasons why this couldn't possibly work. I'm preaching to the choir here. But mostly, why didn't at least one of these so many neighbors testify to this? She goes on, unfortunately. For drowning me in liquor and wine because I didn't want to drink. How did he do this? Did he hold you down and pour it down your throat? And what about your diagnosis of alcohol abuse syndrome, commonly called alcoholism, that you didn't disagree with during your trial? I don't think it was George drowning you, Sarah. I think that was a choice you made all on your own. And the claims just keep on coming. threatening to kill my friends and neighbors when they checked on me to make sure I was alive and in one piece. What friends? No one from pre-arrest life would speak on her behalf. And then neighbors checked on her? Again, why didn't they testify if they were so concerned about her? Why wouldn't they get up a trial and say, yes, this is what we saw going on all the time? And there was none of that. She also claims he to his batterers intervention classes and probation officer meetings where I would be forced to sit for hours in the parking lot waiting for him when she was arguing with him not to take her car. Well, you also claim that you worked with a probation officer so much and the probation officer loved you. You were the best thing to ever happen to George. And as for his classes, she even went over his homework with him like he was an 8-year-old. And why sit there if she had the car and the keys? Couldn't she leave, go home, and go back and pick him up? Or go to a coffee shop? Something? Why sitting for hours in the parking lot waiting for him? In one of the most horrific things that Sarah accuses George of, she says, for me experiencing ever being arrested and after today prison. That has nothing to do with her actions. It's George's fault, but she's forgiven him. For destroying my reputation and integrity, for my M for murderer scarlet letter. Her reputation, pre-arrest, was already bad enough since all the neighbors knew she was an angry drunk. Even outside her apartment, they wouldn't let her in to go to the bathroom. For destroying her integrity. Show me when she had integrity. And for my M for murderer scarlet letter. She forgives George for that. He's the one that got murdered. She goes on to say, in all of my forgiveness, George is my greatest lesson. Talk about hubris, callousness, utter self-absorption. It's George's fault. He's dead. Not hers. If he hadn't been George, he wouldn't be dead. Not if I hadn't been drunk, if I hadn't been angry, if I hadn't been vengeful. Nope. It's George's fault. He's dead.
I also forgive the Torres family, his mother and father foremost, also his 2 ex-wives and daughters, all for knowing who George was capable of and has done in the past, his history of violence and where he learned it, then to keep turning a blind eye when I would ask for help. All of his siblings, including Farrell Torres, who is now on his way to prison for stabbing the mother of their baby in the side of her head. For everyone who knew what George was doing to me, sometimes how and when, but allowed and enabled. I forgive them for caring too late. I hope they all ask themselves while quiet and comfortable in bed at night the uneasy question, what could I have done to stop this from happening to both of them? And after all the time Sarah tried to, by asking for help from all of us and so many times.
I was so absolutely shocked by her accusations to the Torres family that I nearly said, I'm not going to even talk about those in this video. But I think it's important to look at how Sarah structures these accusations because it gives us some insight, even more insight, into the way her mind works. Notice that she addresses his mother and father, his 2 ex-wives, his daughters, and all of his siblings as she's explaining these people that enabled him. No one is mentioned by name until she gets to Farrell Torres. And then she adds his name and the detail that he's now on his way to prison for stabbing the mother of their baby in the side of her head. But everybody else is this sort of generic lump of enablers until she can pull out this one detail that says, see, it's true because your other son's a loser. She needs to be a little careful here because she has a brother in prison as well. Plus, those of us that have been around for a few years know that Just because one person in a family does something doesn't mean the entire family will act the same way. But to Sarah, they will. She adds an extra little slam when she says, I hope they all ask themselves, while quiet and comfortable in bed at night, the uneasy question, what could I have done to stop this from happening to both of them? And after all the times Sarah tried to, by asking for help from all of us and so many times. Throw some blame and guilt on people? On his family? I actually have a different wish. I hope Sarah asks herself that question. While quiet and uncomfortable in prison at night, what could I have done to stop this from happening? Maybe I could have quit drinking. Maybe I could have gotten out of the relationship. There's a number of things. But no, she wants to make sure his family feels guilty. And I hope the Torres family doesn't buy into this. Sarah does something else that I may be stretching a little bit on this, and let me know in the comments below if you think I am. But it's the way she talks about George's daughters. So, I wrote to his family and daughters. She talks about his family and separates out his daughters every single time she refers to them, as if they're not part of his family. Now, I don't know if it's because she's thinking of his family as his parents and brothers and sisters, and so the daughters are in a separate category, or if she's sending a special little signal just to them, and let me show you why I think that. First of all, she says, I wrote to his family and daughters apologizing and asking for their forgiveness, but due to fear that my life or my son's would be jeopardized, I did not send. We're going to talk about this a little more when we talk about her apology, but she was going to ask the daughters for their forgiveness, but was afraid that her life or her son's would be jeopardized, meaning they would come back and kill her. Well, first of all, she's in jail, supposedly crying under her cot into her mattress for months on end. But she's afraid that they would go attack her son. So she wants their forgiveness, even though she thinks they're vengeful, murdering people that would harm an 8-year-old. She mentions the daughters again when she's getting ready to make her verbal statement. My verbal statement, is primarily to the Torres family, to the judge, and to his daughters. Again, singling them out. And she says, I hope that everyone can forgive me, the Torres family most of all, and his daughters, because I know what he meant to them. And even as I first heard her say this, in the shock of everything else she was saying, that phrase, because I know what he meant to them, sounded false. Remember that she wanted George to call his daughter when he was drunk because it upset his daughter to talk to him when he was like that, and she was goading him to do it. Remember, too, that she bought that suitcase for George when they were going to Pennsylvania to visit his daughters because he hadn't seen one of them in, I think, years. So whatever relationship George had with his daughters, there was some strain in there. And that's not a slam against the Torres family, because there are oftentimes strains between parents and children for a number of reasons. Saying, I know what he meant to them, is very different than saying, because I know they loved him. What he meant to them seems like one of those double entendres where, yeah, I know what he meant to you. And I wonder if this isn't a subtle slam to the daughters. Yeah, you really didn't love him. You're being all lovey now, but I know better. I hope it's not. I hope I'm reading into this. But given Sarah's statement as a whole, I could completely see her doing this. So in the 3 areas that she was allowed to choose out of her long table of contents, the last one she picked was social media. In my criminal case, as a result, my opportunities to be given a fair, proper, and uninfluenced successful conclusion was heavily depleted and poisoned. I forgive them. All of the media tycoons taking blood money, it's all over their hands and keyboards. Okay, so first of all, I think your jury was going on a lot more than social media. They were going on the evidence. And successful conclusion, if there had been no social media at all, they would have just gone by the evidence as well, and you would have been convicted. Blame us if you want, but you also took full advantage of social media, Sarah, with all your letters. You seem to like freedom of the press when it works for you, not so much for everybody else. And then the reference to media tycoons taking blood money, it's all over their hands and keyboards, as if media tycoons are actually typing about her and putting it up on social media. I'm not a tycoon, I can tell you that. But I can also tell you, I have no blood on my hands. See? No blood. And I checked my keyboard, and I don't have any blood on there either. I just have cat fur and actually an awful lot of cookie crumbs that I need to take care of. But no blood. Sorry, Sarah. But what's Sarah's ultimate forgiveness? I forgive myself for not escaping permanently, for not fighting back sooner to save myself. For not fighting back sooner to save myself. This sounds like she's saying, for not killing George sooner. For not fighting back sooner. There are a lot of other ways to deal with this than physically fighting back. So her regret isn't that she fought back by zipping him up in a suitcase and the other things she did. It's just that she didn't do it sooner. Talk about no remorse whatsoever. Wow. So after this entire time of painting George as this horrible person who did every possible type of abuse all the time, Sarah takes a bizarre turn to overly romanticize the relationship. And again, with Sarah, there are no half measures. Everything is extreme. I forgive myself for falling in love with a monster, and no matter how grotesque he may become, I still loved him, hoped, and forgave. George made me then, now, and always love him. Well, except for all those times he was, kicking you, tripping you, making you wear an M for murderous scarlet letter, and making you go to prison. But you love him all the time. I think of him every day and still speak to him when alone on the rec yard. I ask his forgiveness and that he looks for me at the gates of heaven so I can tell him how sorry I am, endlessly, and that I never stopped loving it, and that I never stopped loving him in all of it and still. Oh, they're going to be reunited in heaven and everything's going to be just fine. I wonder if she ever is alone on the rec yard. She's not done yet. George haunts me. He is everywhere, I believe, because I do still love him, think of him, and miss his laugh the most. When did he ever laugh? According to you, all the time he was beating you up. In my heart, I know he is with me and understands that this tragedy was not intentional. She never uses the word death. She never uses this murder. She never uses anything like that. She uses euphemisms, this tragedy. And of course, she's got to get in there that it's not intentional. And the worst of all of them, the one that makes me cringe the most, I will forever have George Torres with me in my heart and in my mind, my body, and my soul, as he and I used to say that we were one soul split into two bodies. Ugh. That just, that's just cheesy writing, and I don't know, maybe there are some men that talk like that, but then finally we get to the part where Sarah is supposed to apologize. I finally realized, besides all the shocking things she said, part of what was getting to me about all of this was the uneven treatment, where wrongs done to Sarah were mountainous, and they got a lot of time and attention from her and a crazy amount of detail. On the other hand, wrongs Sarah has done was just this little tiny thing that was barely admitted. And this uneven treatment doesn't fit with true repentance and asking for genuine forgiveness. Keep in mind, when you say sorry, the ideal way to do it is to add "I'm sorry for," and then explain whatever it was so that the person knows you understand why they were upset and you're apologizing for that. Sarah never once finishes the second half of the "I'm sorry" sentence. She says "I'm sorry" a lot. She says "I ask for forgiveness," with this sort of undertone of, look at all the forgiveness I just gave you, you better give it to me. But there isn't a "I am sorry for what happened to George." The uneven treatment of the things she's forgiven that have been done to her versus things she's asking for forgiveness for that she has done is blatant and very concerning. In typical Sarah fashion, the forgiveness she asks for is full of exaggeration. She says, "My apology is profuse and ceaseless." Is it? She goes and asks for George, the Torres family, Judge Cranick, and the entire planet to forgive her. But after she explains that her apology is profuse and ceaseless, she follows it with this: "Allow me, please, to brush off the muck, wipe the blood off my face, and fix the cuts on my skin. I ask for understanding in what really happened and for how long." She immediately focuses back on herself as a victim, because the muck and the blood and fixing the cuts is all from allegedly being beaten up. So, forgive me so I can take care of all this injury that I've sustained and understand what really happened and for how long. Yeah, we understand it because we saw the evidence, Sarah. For what? She never says what her apology is for. And that makes it lack even more sincerity than the whole context it's put in. But there are some other things she doesn't mention as well. When it comes to word death, you would think you would hear that quite a bit, given the circumstances. We do hear Sarah say the word 3 times, but it's not apologizing for the death of George Torres. It's for stabbing me in the leg and not letting me call 911 for an ambulance or seek help where I nearly bled to death. Or, when she's talking about her spiritual side, if I were not beaten to death, I was going to work myself to death on the outside. That's why she couldn't read her Bible. And work herself to death? You need to have a job to do that. So nothing about George's death, just about hers. She never uses the word responsible, responsibility, or any form of it at all. She never mentions the image of his death in her mind. She never says something like, "George haunts me because I picture him in that suitcase," or "when I opened that suitcase and saw him." None of that. Coupled with that, she never mentions feeling guilty. A different person would feel horrible about what happened, whether it was accidental or not. And certainly, she never mentions anything about all that abuse of him that we're aware of. That doesn't serve her purpose of being a victim.
I'm sorry. Words do not define my shame. And I don't know what else it is that I can say and convey to the Torres family how this happened. The ifs and whys and how really don't matter. It happened, and I'm sorry. Words cannot describe.
For someone who uses as many words as Sarah does, and such voluminous amount of detail, when it comes to actually addressing George's death, she is very succinct. And she also says things like how this happened, and the ifs and whys and how really don't matter. It happened. She doesn't say George's death happened. She doesn't say his murder happened. This and it. And also, how this happened, the ifs and whys, and how really don't matter. Yes, they really do. Because the ifs and whys and hows are what led to George's death. Now, she's already said her version of ifs and whys and hows, it all had to do with how they brought George up and enabling him to beat her and all of that. But the ifs and whys and hows of what happened that night and how he ended up in that suitcase and his suffocation, those don't matter. It happened, and I'm sorry. Words cannot describe. Yeah, they can. And Sarah, you know how to describe things. You just described everything you allege he did to you. But words can't describe what you did to him. Or actually, in this case, words can't describe how sorry you are. You're able to wax poetic on how much you love him, but you can't talk about how sorry you are that you killed him. There are no words. Yeah, there are some words. But the dismissive, the ifs and whys and how really don't matter. To address his family and just minimize that after you've just maximized how horrible you say he was, that is a slam as well, and I think she knows it. So that covers the general themes and structure of Sarah's speech. But within it, there were other notable language and content choices that struck me. The first was her referencing the stabbing in her leg several times. The other was her almost deifying herself. The numerous times she mentioned her son and how she did that. Let's take a look at each of these. Sarah brought up the stab wound that George allegedly gave her repeatedly. And I've always found this story troublesome. Supposedly, she was bringing him a nice steak dinner in bed, and they were watching a movie, and he got angry, and she tried to get out of the bed, and he stabbed her in the leg with a steak knife. Then he wouldn't let her go to the ER, and she almost bled to death, kind of thing. And we saw photographs of her wound, and it was serious. But the story itself just sounds so contrived. I'm thinking either a freak accident, or maybe she did it to herself and told George, I'm going to tell the police you did this. I don't know. We'll never know. But let's look at when she brings this up. First, it's in that laundry list we looked at of laughed at, tripped, and stabbed in there. Then she brings it up in the list of more detailed grievances she has for stabbing me in the leg and not letting me call 911 for an ambulance or seek help, where I nearly bled to death. And even in the romanticized version of her life with George, she says, almost everything reminds me of him, seeing my stab wound every day especially. And then she goes on to talk about how she still loves him, bringing that stab wound back. And actually, at this point, it should be more of a scar than a wound. The scars that I have on the inside, my outside scars have healed, except for my stab wound. Throwing that in even at the end. That might be because it's the only real thing she has to reference. I mean, certainly if she had been Ard, is in that list or any of the other things in that list, she could bring those up. But the stab wound, because she can point to it. But I'm still not convinced how it got there. The other thing is, remember, she brought up George's brother, who stabbed his partner. Almost as if to say, the brother did it, so did George. True to her exaggerated sense of self and her extremism, in some ways Sarah seems to paint herself as a deity. Now, I've talked about her as Saint Sarah in other videos, but there are some interesting things she says in her statement that bring this word deity to mind. She says, and even after all that's been said and done, theorized, hypothesized, scrutinized, and blasphemed in my case, still no one knows me. That word blasphemed is usually used in reference to religion and the God that someone worships. We don't usually talk about blaspheming another person. But Sarah's so grand, I guess we could blaspheme her. And her phrase, still no one knows me. There are Bible references that talk about no one can know the mind of God, or no one can know God's plans. No one can know Sarah. And yet, in just a few minutes after she says this, she says to the Torres family, you know me, in reference to how they know she really loved George and he loved her. And a few minutes after that, she goes back to saying, you don't know me, to the Torres family and everybody else. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. But generally, someone's actions and what they say and their writings are a pretty good way to get to know them. And Sarah's given us plenty of information. And when she says, to the entire planet, please forgive me. She is so grand, the entire planet knows who she is, like a god, and asking the entire planet's forgiveness. It's probably going to come as a real shocker to her that the entire planet does not know who she is. And even if they did, they probably wouldn't care. There are a lot of crazy things going on our planet right now that are much more serious than Sarah Boone. However, the entire planet, please forgive me. But she doesn't say, please forgive me for what? There's no please forgive me for zipping George in a suitcase and leaving him to suffocate. Then she wants to explain what she would do should she be freed, or when she's free. She wants to advocate for all domestic violence survivors, to help them overcome, heal, still hope always, to make their voices heard, to confidently walk with all of their scars on the outside and the inside, like she walks with her scar from her stabbing. To help them not ever become a casualty of domestic violence as so many others, to stop the abuse and maltreatment before it's too late. She's going to advocate for all domestic violence survivors, not just ones in prison, not just ones in her area, all of them, because she's Super Sarah. And she's going to help them overcome and heal and hope. That's something a god would do. In a very interesting slip of the tongue, at least I think it was a slip of the tongue, when she's being questioned by her lawyer and he's asking her about her spiritual renewal since she's been in prison, she says, I become so much more closer to the Lord and it's made me such a better person. And I hope that I am an example going forward of the Lord's light and can draw as many people to me because of it. Many people to me. Generally, Christians want to be light so they can draw people to the Lord, not to themselves. But Sarah wants to be the center of attention, her own little demigod. And if she's a better person right now, by slamming the Torres family, by maligning George, by painting herself as a victim and refusing to take responsibility, what was she before? Sarah Boone insisted to police that she was an excellent mother. Brian Boone had a different opinion. In her statement, she brings up her son numerous times, and like other times she's brought him up, she doesn't address him by name, just calls him my son. Each time she brings him up, and we'll look at them, notice that she doesn't need to. She could make her point without bringing him into it. So why does she? I think it's a gimmick, and it's a ploy to try and get sympathy, to show that she's a caring mother, to show that there's going to be a son left without a mother if she goes to prison for a long time. It's a manipulative technique using a child, and that's really low. Let's see what she says. I forgive George for beating me senseless for trying to sleep because I had to go to work or my son's field trip the next day. How about just, I forgive George for beating me senseless, if he seriously did. But my son's field trip, I wonder if she ever really did go on a field trip. Brian Boone had trouble just making sure that she was going to pick her son up on time. For ruining my deceased family's heirlooms, traditions, and keepsakes, my son's furniture. Why specifically her son's furniture? Why not just my furniture? He destroyed other furniture besides her son's, allegedly. I had nowhere to feel safe, including the sacred space of my son's room where he beat me bloody on his bed. Why does it matter where George did this? And sacred space of her son's room, that is a bizarre description. I mean, I've had children, and at no point would I ever describe their bedrooms as sacred spaces. And why in particular beat me bloody on his bed? Why those details? For threatening to make me unrecognizable to my son by breaking all of the bones in my face. You could take out to my son, and it would have the same effect. She would be unrecognizable to anyone. Why drag your son into this? For holding me hostage on weekends, my son was supposed to come over. So he never held you hostage any other time? Just when your son was supposed to come over, he was that deliberate and calculated about this? Really? Allegedly. But there's more. For destroying my phone with a hammer because my son called. How about just for destroying my phone with a hammer? And was it really because your son called? What if Brian called? I candidly explained the importance of my car to take my son to school foremost. How often did she take him to school? How often did she pick him up? She seemed kind of unreliable. Not letting me feel safe to live, talk to other people, spend time with my son. How about just not letting me feel safe to live? I forgive myself for not escaping permanently, not fighting for back sooner to save myself, my son, my dog's home, and car. When did George ever threaten her son? What does she mean, save her son? He didn't live with her, thank heavens. I wrote to his family and daughters apologizing and asking for their forgiveness, but due to fear that my life or that of my son would be jeopardized, I did not send. I am sorry. We talked about this one. She was afraid they would come after her son? And as we reach the end, a few miscellaneous oddities in her statement. She says, I was raised hitting a woman was wrong and should never happen, no excuse. That's almost word for word what this gentleman said in his closing argument. Because I remember saying, actually, hitting anybody is wrong, not just a woman. I take offense to the statement of being said that this is just for a moment. The moments before that, in order for me to be here, is endless. Ignore the grammar there. This is her live statement, her one that isn't read. And she's referring to when one of, I don't know if it was George's sister or daughter, but said that this was just a moment in court, but they were going to have to live with this for the rest of their lives. And I don't know exactly why Sarah's taking offense, except she's looking backwards to say, it's not just a moment right now, it's a whole series of moments before this, not just from here on out, implying a whole series of moments when you didn't do anything to help me. You enabled this. And then in my soft-spoken conclusion, I ask this: would I be the darling mother, celebrated woman of the year, if it were I who died? How many daughters, mothers, sisters, aunts, grandmothers, nieces, and friends have been because they did? Soft-spoken conclusion. What? Why are you even bringing up the fact it's soft-spoken? You're trying to be meek and mild? We've read all of your letters, Sarah. We have seen your texts. We have seen videos of your behavior. Soft-spoken, meek, mild, gentle Sarah, who has just slammed his family? And then the idea of she would be the darling mother, celebrated woman of the year if she was dead, if George had killed her. We actually don't look at domestic violence victims as women of the year. We don't elevate them. We empathize, and we wish we could have done something, or something had been done sooner. But we don't glorify them in that way. We look at it situationally and individually and celebrate what that person has done. We don't, this just trivializes the death of these women. And I think that's a pretty horrific thing to do as well. I want to take a moment and talk briefly about the people in court who stood up for Sarah. First, her paid mental health consultant. The prosecution did a great job of dismissing her, and I'm going to leave it at that. But the other people, the people who appeared in court, who appeared on video, who wrote letters, I've seen some folks on YouTube who have really ripped them apart and mocked them. I don't think that's necessary. I think it's cruel. I may not agree with their opinions of Sarah, but for whatever reason, they do have their opinions. And there is freedom of speech, and we are allowed to speak our opinions, and we should be respectful of them. I'm not going to analyze what the defenders said, per se, and I'm not going to analyze why they said it or what kind of relationship they had with Sarah. It's their opinions based on their experiences and where they're at in life. The only thing I will say is that I think it's significant that no one from her life before her arrest came and testified on her behalf. And also that some of their statements, if you look back at them, have a Sarah feel language-wise. I'm not going to do an analysis of it because I think that puts these people in a difficult position and they need their privacy and to be left alone. But if you're listening to her statement again and their statements, you will notice it feels almost like Sarah drafted some of it and they may have adapted it. And I'm going to leave it at that. So what conclusions can we draw? Well, I've been drawing them for the last 45 minutes, but Sarah's exactly where she needs to be. I've heard the arguments that second-degree murder shouldn't come with a lifetime sentence, but I think in her case, there's a special level of depravity. And as the prosecution said, she shows absolutely no remorse and she takes absolutely no responsibility. So thank you for joining me in this very long video and getting to this point. I appreciate it very much. And if you're not subscribed to our Guilty Words family, we'd love to have you join us. It's a terrific group, and there are a lot of exciting things happening in the new year. As I always say, until we meet in the next video, please use your words wisely and well. Take care.